So thank you very much for joining, everybody. A warm welcome from my side as well. As Fernando just introduced, the topic of today's presentation is designing auctions for renewable energy systems well. And I will rely my analysis on international experience and lessons learned. As Fernando just introduced, Ecofys is involved since several years in the design, analysis, and impact on business models of auctions. For example, we have been leading a consortium that advises the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy on the renewals of the Renewable Energy Act 2007. But we are also working for other countries, for example, for the ministry in Luxembourg and for private clients like some utilities in Europe. We're also giving training, and the experience which we gathered in all of these presentations will be the basis of my presentation today. So I would like to start with a very brief introduction in the definition. So what is an auction? Basically, an auction is a competitive allocation mechanism for support for renewable energy, which means that by introducing an auction, the regulator introduces a market, he creates a market. And thereby, when we are talking about design elements, we are actually talking about the rules according to which the market works. You sometimes also find the term tender, which is often in practice used interchangeably with auctions. A tender is very much the procurement process. And the procurement process may include an auction, but does not necessarily have to. So whenever you come across the term tender and auction, they are often used interchangeably, but you have to actually look up the details to find out what it actually means. So what we're talking about today is really creating a market for this support. Now the content of my presentation will go along 4 lines. First, I'll briefly go into the reasons why we actually see a renaissance of renewable energy auctions. I then introduce design elements. I briefly touch upon design challenges, and I will close with some comments on auctions from a business perspective, which a policymaker should also keep in mind when actually designing auctions. Let's start with the first step, the renaissance of renewable energy auctions. The IRENA actually made an analysis and published this analysis a year ago, where they saw that in 2005 there were only a few countries around the world which had auctions for renewable energy support. Most of the countries actually determined the level of support in an administrative way. However, within 10 years, this number increased tenfold. And if we now have a look at some of the examples which we find in Europe, for example, we see that there is a contract of difference scheme in the UK since 2014. We see the SDE Plus in the Netherlands, already quite long active since 2011, but with some important changes made since then. In Germany, we saw a pilot scheme for ground-mounted PV, which has been introduced in 2015. And now this scheme has been extended with the Renewable Energy Act, which I just mentioned briefly in the beginning, which will become effective by the 1st of January 2017. And in Italy, we see a system which is actually in place since 2012. Other European countries are quite famously the offshore auctions in Denmark. Also, Poland recently introduced an Energy Act which says that they will switch from the quota system to an auction-based system. Spain has held actually auction for wind and biomass. France has prominent auctions for PV, and Greece just recently introduced auctions as well. What we see, without going through the details of the history of all of these schemes, is that you have recent policy developments which changed the schemes and which changed it, like adapted them a little bit, and you see a lot of learning going in. But in general, what we can see is that a lot of these countries actually switch to these auction schemes. I mentioned these 4 countries here in a little bit more detail because a lot of the examples to which I refer to in the next part will actually refer to this country. However, before we go into the design details, let us first analyze why do we see auctions. So first of all, in Europe, a lot of the member states introduced them because the European State Aid Guidelines actually required the introduction of auctions. They say that by 2017, a bidding mechanism, so a competitive allocation mechanism, should become default. And even in 2015, 2016, at least 5% of renewable energy support by member states should be auctioned. The guidelines apply to all of the support schemes which need state aid clearance. So this is definitely an important driver. But there's also some reasons as to why countries should have an inherent interest, or why some of them actually have pushed for auctions. Let's have a look at the opportunities, which you see on the left hand of the slide. So first of all, a lot of the countries want to control the maximum volume and have a control on this maximum support cost. This basically means that with raising shares of renewables, not only the effective implementation of support, which then leads to the maximum amount of possible installations, but also a control of this amount and declining support costs are actually becoming more important. The support level is determined by the market. As we saw in the beginning, this is a market mechanism, and not the administration, as it previously often has been the case. Now, this means that there's more exposure to the market, but it also means that we have some elements of generation of information. There often has been a criticism that there's a lack of information between private actors, between market participants and the regulator, which actually leads to windfall profits or too high support. So the idea behind auctions is that the lack of information is not so important anymore, because the level of support is determined by the market and not the administration. Now, the third point is that there is some competition between the renewable energy producers, and the expectation is that this may lower prices. Again, as we see rising shares of renewables, prices for support become more important, and this is then an important driver for some of the countries to actually switch to auctions. And the last point is a real cost discovery. This point is often brought forward if we have a relatively new technology where nobody really knows where the price is, and then you have a market mechanism to determine where it actually lies. It has been used in China this way. Now, if we switch to the challenges, which should also guide a little bit the discussion which we are going to have today during the webinar, we see 4 points. So first of all, we see a challenge to ensure high realization rates and to actually fulfill the target, to see that the projects which have been awarded are actually realized. The second point, the risk for the renewable energy producers increases, and this might be challenging for smaller actors. We will come back to this point later on, but this might also increase costs, because risk, after all, has to be calculated, and if the risk becomes too high, we will also see that the cost may increase. And very particular for auctions, there's a common value problem. So basically, if there's an uncertainty over the project cost, or if we have unexperienced bidders, they may bid for prices which they cannot realize in the end, which then leads to a winner's curve. Again, we will come back to this point. And the fourth point, we have a risk of strategic behavior, particularly if we have not so many actors in the market, or if the design is not well done. And this might, again, lead to higher prices and support costs. So I would like to ask you to keep these opportunities and challenges in mind when we now go through the remainder of the presentation. So let's start with the design elements. What is actually important? On this slide, you see an overview of the most important design elements. I don't expect you to read them now, but I will guide you through them. So basically, we have the, what we see here is the impact on the auction design. So on the left, we have those elements which actually really change the design of the auction. It doesn't mean that they are the elements which are most crucial for having a successful auction, but which will basically change how the auction looks like. So on the left, we have what is actually auctioned or remunerated. So do you have to apply for capacity or for energy? And do you see a multi versus a single item auction? If we go along to those which have a little bit less important, less impact on the on the design, we see the grouping of the technology, but also the procedure, dynamic versus status. And then we go into like what is the frequency, how often do I hold the evaluation criteria, like price only or multi-criterion, the ceiling size and the methodology, how to actually determine it. On the left, on the bottom here, you have rather procedural questions, whereas if we go here to the right, these are the points which rather concern the qualification criteria and the penalties, so basically what happens after you have been awarded. And what we will do now is that we go through these elements in a little bit more detail, and I explain how they have been implemented in the 4 countries which I mentioned, and also what the impact of this decision has been. So first of all, let's have a look at the technologies which are actually chosen for the auction. You have some countries which implement technology neutral auction. So basically you have all the technologies competing against each other in one big market, on one big pot. And on the other hand, you have technology-specific auctions, which would group technologies, for example, according to the resource, like wind offshore, wind onshore, ground-mounted PV, and so on and so forth. You could even see a further grouping along the size of the technology or along other criteria. But these are kind of the ones which we see more often in the market. In the middle, you have a grouping of technology. For example, according to mature or firm renewable energy systems, so according to the feed-in characteristics. And if we have a look how it has been chosen in the country, we see that the UK has chosen for a grouped auction. The Netherlands opted for one pot, but they have technology-specific elements, for example, regarding the maximum price. However, offshore wind has a different pot. So offshore wind has a different auction. Italy has a technology-specific auction as well as Germany. However, Germany recently introduced, as I said, the Renewable Energy Act, and there's one paragraph saying that there is an option to introduce a grouped pilot scheme between PV and solar. Between PV and wind. Another one which I mentioned in the first slide on the overview was the question of a single versus a multi-item auction. And that actually was fundamentally different. If you have a look on the left, you actually see a single item auction. Sometimes it's also called site-specific auction. It basically means that you have a site which is selected by the regulator, and different bidders can compete for this particular site. You see that very often for large technologies. So, for example, in the Netherlands and in Germany, you see that for offshore, as well as in Denmark, but it's not included in this overview. On the other hand, you have a multi-item auction, which means that you have that every developer develops its own project, And when they're eligible for participating in the auction, they compete with their project. This is what we understand as a multi-item, also sometimes called decentralized auction. And we see that in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Italy, and also in Germany, but only for smaller technologies. So not for offshore wind, but for onshore wind and for PV. The next one is the procedure. Now I will guide you through this slide so that you really understand it. On the left there's a static auction which is shown. It basically means that you have an auction volume, which is shown here in the red, and you have bids in shown in green, which compete for this auction volume. And every bidder actually submits one bid. It's called a static auction. Therefore, you can't change your auction, your bid afterwards, or in function of the bids which are also on the market. But you just put your offer in this one pot. The bids are then arranged, and they are awarded up to the end of the volume. We see that in the UK, in Italy, and in Germany. In Italy, there's one specifica, which is that you don't bid a price that you would like to receive, but you bid a digression from a maximum price, which turns out to be the same in the end, but it's a slightly different procedure. On the right, we have a dynamic auction. This is what is the case in the Netherlands. And the dynamic auction goes in different rounds or in different phases. So in the first phase, we have a rather small remuneration, which you receive if you're awarded in the first round. Now, these two projects, which I have shown here in a schematic overview, actually said that they can realize at this price. Now, the cumulative spending, so the budget which was available, haven't been exhausted in the first phase, so the second phase is opened. And this second phase, the remuneration is actually higher. So what we can see here is that 4 more projects were actually willing to bid in this second phase. And as the budget hasn't been exhausted, we see a third phase which is open, where again the remuneration increases. And according to a first come first served process in the Netherlands, you actually might receive a remuneration up until the cumulative spending is done. So this is it's exhausted. So this is what we understand as a dynamic auction. And as you can see, it works fundamentally different. Like we can't combine both of them, yet both of them can work smoothly. Like it's not a factor for success which auction design I've chosen, which procedure I've chosen. If we now go a little bit more into the details, we see quite an important, or we see one design feature, which is the price rules. It is often discussed, and you basically have in a static auction 2 price rules. One is a pay as bid, and one is a uniform price rule. Now, as a pay as bid, everybody gets what the person bids, and as a uniform price, everybody gets what actually what the last awarded bid gets. And what we see is, if we have a look in this column, is that the price rule differs between the countries. So the UK actually has opted for uniform price per delivery year. The Netherlands for uniform by phase. It's actually quite difficult to not have a pay as bid rule if you have a dynamic system. Italy has a pay as bid auction, and actually they have a different system, which is the registry, which has a fixed price, and where bids are not awarded according to the price, but according to qualitative criteria. And Germany has a pay as bid price rule. However, during the pilot for ground mounted wind, they also tried out uniform. In theory, both can work well. And in theory, both should actually even lead to the same result and to the same cost. We have some caveats to that. The most important one, what we see in practice, even though in theory there shouldn't be a reason as why to react in this way is that in the uniform pricing rules, there are some bidders, particularly unexperienced and smaller bidders, which bid too low. And if you have a lot of other bidders on the market, it doesn't really matter much. But if you are the one which is actually here, so which sets the price, you might end up with a project which is not economically viable. And we have seen that in the UK with 2 solar projects, which have actually then not been realized. We've seen that in Germany in the 2 pilot schemes. In this case, it hasn't been as much of a problem because there were enough other bidders to set the price. But we have seen that also in Spain, where the result was 0. So basically, renewable energy will not get a support in the auction because everybody bid with 0, and now the result is 0. So this is definitely not what is intended. So uniform is apparently a little bit more difficult to introduce, even though there shouldn't be a reason as to why it shouldn't work. It's just a matter of what we see in practice. Now, the next is the timing of the auction. So far, we only talked about procedural questions. So what actually happens within the auction. But what I want to briefly touch upon now is actually the timing. So when does the auction take place in the project cycle? I'd ask you to have a look here where you see the different project phases of a typical renewable energy project. In this case, I just took wind as an example, but you could take another. So for example, you go through a phase of preliminary planning, you then have the project plan, the permitting procedure, construction, and the operation. Obviously, we have more detailed phases as well, but these are the main ones. Now, the question is, when do you actually start the auction? Do you start it here, or do you rather put it afterwards, or even after the permitting procedure, which we would call a late auction? It's a terminology which now becomes more common. It's just a definition. Like if it's in the beginning of the planning process, we have an early auction, and late we have a late auction. Now, what you really would like to avoid, both from a policy perspective, but also from a private perspective, is this, what I've shown here. So in general, the risk of a project to fail becomes quite important. It's quite important in the beginning, which you can see here, like a lot of projects actually fail, can't be concluded. Yet costs actually increase here. So most of the costs come with the construction, not the planning. When you arrive at the time of the auction, you want to have as many projects in there that can be realized, so where at least you can estimate the realization rate. At the same time, you don't want to set the realization deadline in a way that project developers will fail just because it has been too short by design. In most of the countries, the sites for renewables are limited, so you shouldn't limit them further just by design. There's no benefit to it. And there's a second point why the timing is very important, which is the actor composition in the market. So what we see is that in the beginning, you have rather professional project developers, but then other actors become more important at later stages, particularly small actors. Obviously, this also depends on the country, but we see a change in the structure. And normally, some of these actors can rather well cope with the risk, whereas others can't. And you should find a timing of the auction which is suitable for everybody. Now, if we have a look on how to do so, we see that the regulator can do so by defining the pre-qualification requirements and by the penalties. So this is what has been shown here on this slide in the orange color, which you find here. Basically, the good point about qualification requirements and the reason why you should actually define some, is that you can select projects with a sufficient progress and planning, and you could also select serious bids. The best point about it is that you have sunk costs, so basically those projects which are not awarded, or even those which are awarded, cannot really calculate the project development cost in their offer if it's really a highly competitive market. So this might become challenging to actually then have economically viable projects. And at the same time, this can also be a prohibitive barrier for some bidders if the entry requirements are too high. For example, if you define entry requirements which relate to the type of the bidder, and you have a lot of liquidity requirements, some of the actors may just not be able to meet these requirements, even though they could be able to do very nice projects. And the second lever which you have as a policymaker are penalties, which you can use to incentivize the realization. You will rather realize a project if you see a penalty. But on the other hand, also again, this increases the risk for bidders, and this might be a prohibitive barrier. So how have countries chosen? Basically, we see that in a lot of the, like in the 4 countries, you rather see later auctions, so rather after the permitting stage. Whereas in Germany, there's one exception, it's for PV, where it's rather at the early stage of the permitting, where not a lot of project development costs have actually been spent. And in terms of monitoring and penalties, you see different approaches. So the UK actually excludes projects from further rounds, which hasn't been very effective because so far there hasn't been any further rounds. But you have a penalty once the contract for difference is actually signed, and the authorities monitor the progress of the project, which is not the case in the other countries, where you get a financial penalty in Italy and Germany if you do not realize, or if you realize with a delay. What you should also keep in mind again is that if you have too many restrictions, the number of bids and therefore the level of competition is reduced. And basically, if you reduce the level of competition, this might have a conflict with the goal of reducing price. So again, this is a kind of a balancing mechanism to design the auction well, which also leads us to the design challenges. I already introduced some of them in the very beginning, but one of the most important is actually a policy challenge. So what we see is in the design of auctions, there might be some conflicting and implicit goals. And what you actually want to have as a policymaker, but also from market stability perspective, is to have a rather big political acceptance for this system. And this requires trade-offs, particularly regarding effectiveness, so realizing as much projects of the ones which have been awarded without delay, and efficiency, which means like having a high level of competition and limit the transaction costs and minimize the risk. And the second problem is, as I said, like a lot of policymakers have implicit goals, like small actors, like regional distribution, like a social economic impact, which should be kept in mind. From our perspective from Ecofys, we recommend that you design an auction scheme to be aware of this implicit goal and to understand them and to thereby be able to consider them. In order to do so, the main solution is that you do not understand the design of an auction just at this point. Right now we have briefly went through this part, which is really like the design criteria, but designing an auction involves a target definition, involves a market analysis, and you should also monitor the implementation phase. And what we have seen in the very beginning, a lot of the auction schemes have changed and have been readapted in the course of their implementation, which basically leads to better design after some rounds. So our recommendation from Ecofys is to really take this process, to consider this process as an entire process from target definition to implementation, and to make sure that you do not miss out on some of these steps, because then you might actually miss out on some of the very important constraints of it. So the effectiveness challenge is that you have to ensure high realization rates, as I said. And we saw that in some of the countries, there were problems with it. So for example, in the Netherlands, we saw good realization for wind, onshore, and PV, but rather low for geothermal. And in the UK, we had some instances of underbidding, and in Italy, we saw major delays in the beginning of the auction round. Also in Germany, in the PV auctions, what we see is that a lot of the successful bidders seem to wait until the very end of the realization period, probably because they want to wait for prices to come down, but we can't make a definite conclusion on the realization rate yet, as the realization rate hasn't ended yet. The measures to improve so is really that sometimes you should tighten the qualification requirements, and you should sometimes introduce more reliable penalties, particularly regarding penalties. It's good to provide a security for the penalty, sometimes called bid bonds, and this security should be backed, for example, by a reliable bank or by a financial guarantee, because what we saw in Italy is that the securities weren't reliable and therefore not very effective. And basically, as a no-regret option, you have to balance the qualification. You have to balance the qualification criteria and the penalties. They both work together. The efficiency challenge is basically to, well, a lot of policymakers would say, to bring down costs from an academic perspective or from a theoretical perspective, we would rather say to allocate support efficiently. And the problem there is that sometimes you see a mismatch between option volume and demand, hence the market analysis, which is important. Also, sometimes transaction costs are actually quite large. You might crowd out some actors, but in the long run reduces competition on the general market. And the expectation of competition is actually reflected in the price. Now, to ensure efficiency, the levers which you have in a small country, for example, you could group technology to increase the available volume on the market, which increases competition. However, there are some caveats to that as well, because what we saw in the UK, for example, is that there's one technology which is dominant, which is wind in the UK, and others do not really have a chance. So designing a technology neutral or grouped option is even more challenging than technology specific option. You can have an early option to ease the participation barrier, and you should eliminate unproductive risk. However, on a no-regret basis, you should have a transparent, easy, non-discriminatory auction scheme. Which also leads me to the diversity challenge. You should ensure that everybody can participate in the auction. Again, there you need the market analysis. You need to understand who's actually active at what stages of the project family. And measures to protect certain actors are on one side easy access, but you could also think of bonuses or quotas of preferential treatment, as it has been chosen in Germany. There's a multi-criteria evaluation auction in Italy. And we could also expand particular projects from auctions, for example, small projects, which is in Europe possible under the minimum rules of the state aid guidelines. I would now come to the last part of my presentation, which is auctions from a bidder's perspective. And this should rather serve as an outlook, because it often makes sense to not only have a look from a policy perspective, but also try to imagine how you would act as a market participant in order to then find the little details which you would have to adjust in the auction design. So from a bidder's perspective, a project needs to be competitive to win, which doesn't mean that it has to have very low cost. It just has to be better than the rest. And this is, the logic behind that is different from an administrative type feed-in tariff, for example. And what you have to be able to do is you have to be better in practice but measure. So for example, in financing is actually a very important factor, the weighted average cost of capital, because renewables are highly capital intensive. The resource matters greatly, like the solar resource, the wind resource, but also the cost for resources in the case of biomass, for example. A lot of countries, as I said, have limited sites available, so land lease is actually quite important. But let's assume you have a good connection to the turbine supplier, or you have economies of scale. You might actually have a reduced turbine cost compared to the others. And what you basically need to do as a participant in the market is to identify the factors where you have been better than the rest. And how do you actually go about making your offer? Again, this is important from a policy perspective. If you think about the strategic bidding, for example, let's have a look here in step 1, which is here. The bidder has to calculate the LCOE, so the levelized cost of electricity, of its own project. This is normally what the project needed to do in the beginning, like in an administrative project system as well. But this is also where the project could stop to make the financial analysis. Now they have 2 more steps. First, you have to quantify your risk profile. If you are a bidder which which cannot really mitigate a risk of not having this particular project, you are rather risk averse, and you might opt for a smaller risk premium. Whereas when you are a bidder which has a large portfolio, for example, you could also bid a little bit higher prices and hope that this project gets through, and if it doesn't, well, you try the next round. And as a third step, you then have to have information on the market. So basically, you need to know the available volume on the market. You need to get to know the LCOE of the competing projects. You need to know the risk aversion of the competitors. And in the end, you also need to estimate what is the knowledge of the others on your project. All in all, this basically means one thing: information becomes more important. So if you think from a project developer's perspective, you should think how much of that information is available on the market. And one measure of policy design could also to make sure that this information is available for everybody to actually adjust the competitive position of everybody. Now, if we summarize it in terms of lessons learned, the first point is that the design of the analyzed auction schemes differ, both between countries, but also what we have seen between technologies. Offshore in Germany is very different from onshore in Germany. Same is true in the Netherlands. The factors impacting the auction design are influenced by the maturity of the technology, the maturity and the composition of the market, but also by the policy goals. And this then basically creates some restrictions to all the design options which I have introduced, which are available. All of that to say there is no one-size-fits-all auction scheme. It needs to be fine-tuned to the market. It is a challenging exercise, but it's not impossible. And the second lessons learned, there are some no-regret options if you do design an auction. First, you have to analyze, understand, and integrate policy goals in the design process. You should select qualification criteria and penalties in a way such that you balance the quality of the bid on the one hand and the bidder's risk both in the project development phase and after being awarded to a reasonable amount. You should have a transparent, easy and non-discriminatory auction scheme, which increases the level of competition and therefore the efficiency. And all that you should do in a transparent and inclusive policy design process. This increases the acceptance of the scheme and leads to more stable schemes, but also this leads to a better support scheme. And from a bidder's perspective, the trend to introduce auctions, which we see on an international level, means that information becomes more important. This was my last comment here. I thank you very much for your time so far. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions. In case you have some afterwards, you can also contact me or my colleagues Fabian Wiegand, Corinna Klessmann, or Anna Amasto with any further questions.